Uh, this is an introductory presentation about a new form of dialogue that is only becoming more and more known about in the world. It was really, its origins go back as far as the 1980s, but in a sense, its history from the point of view of its very, very beginnings go back much further. It's a form of dialogue that puts emphasis on two important elements. One is suspension, and the other is proprioception. With suspension, a simple example would be if we are in a dialogue, all sitting in a circle where everybody's on the level, there's no chairperson, and everybody is free to express their views as long as they are also aware of the responsibility of listening to the views of others that may be different than their own. Then suspension can mean I may find myself disagreeing with somebody who's saying something, but at the same time, in my background consciousness, something is getting suspended where I'm at least open to discover more about what the other person really means. And that would be a simple version of suspension. In the world at the moment, with so much conflict and polarization, there is actually practically very little suspension taking place when people are exploring something together, something that may be tremendously important for them to take decisions about, but have a problem with others who disagree with their views. So suspension is a sort of a space which allows each person's view to be more clearly understood, because what people don't sometimes realize, our meaning is something very complex and deep. But in order to try and, for me to communicate my meaning to you, I have a vehicle that I can resort to. And that vehicle is words. I can try and imbue the meaning I have into the words I am using. But meaning is beyond the words I am using, or the deeper aspects of my meaning will always exist way beyond the words I am using. And often that deeper meaning is something I myself will probably not be aware of. However, in the interaction between people, where there is respect for difference, other people can then point to the implications of what I'm saying, and I may then understand that there was a deeper meaning than even I was consciously aware of when I started to speak. I may, of course, on the other hand, discover that my views are incorrect. That's also a possibility. But in a dialogue culture, if there can be some respect for the importance of mistakes, mistakes are hugely, hugely important roads we can travel on to discover something much deeper that we would not have discovered if the mistake we hadn't made in the first place. But there's deep cultural influences that somehow program people into assuming there's something wrong with making mistakes. David Bohm, one of the pioneers of this new form of dialogue, once remarked, when somebody said, "Oh, something is wrong," he said, "No, it's not wrong, it's a mistake. But it's not a mistake to be wrong." And there's this powerful message in that, especially in the world that we now live in, where most people haven't had the opportunity to explore why is it that we have so much difficulty in communicating with one another, and especially when we have differences of opinion. The tragedy is even deeper because there is very little problem with communicating with people who have the same viewpoint as we have. Then that descends into what's called group mind. Nazism would be an example of that. However, there is a difference between collective intelligence and group mind. And to a large extent, the emergence of this new form of dialogue is actually, I think, essentially an attempt to expose the dangers of group mind, but also partake of the gifts of collective intelligence. So in my own experience of being introduced to this form of dialogue, I was living in California. I was going to university in San Francisco, and I attended a seminar by David Bohm in Ojai in Southern California. And it was 1989. And at that seminar, David Bohm spoke about this new form of dialogue that I hadn't encountered before. When I came back to live in Ireland in 1990, I started a dialogue group. And this leads me in to say something about the other element, which I haven't really said much about yet, which is proprioception. So in Ireland at the time, the only way I could start to discover what this new form of dialogue was that I had to just plunge right in and initiate a dialogue group, which I did by inviting a number of people I knew who might be interested. So they came to the first dialogue meeting I organized at my house in Tramore in Ireland, where we were living at the time. And there was about 12 people. So at the beginning of that meeting, I had already decided I wanted to sit in one of the chairs that was sort of a bit in the background. And I probably was nervous, I'm sure, and somehow being a little bit in the background, I would sort of reduce my nervousness because I had no idea how to initiate this meeting. However, what happened was, at one point, everybody had arrived and I hadn't yet gone to the seat I wanted to sit in. And when I came into the room, I had to leave the room for a minute or two. When I came back in, somebody else had taken that seat. And I was left then having to take the only seat left in the room, which was the seat right in front of the fireplace. So anyway, the meeting started and we were all in this process of trying to find our way. I said some things at the start to give some sense to the other people of the spirit of this form of dialogue. But in any case, what happened was, about halfway through the dialogue meeting, which was taking place for an hour and a half, one of the people at the meeting got very angry with me all of a sudden. And she said to me, "Look where you're sitting. You have picked the place in the room which has the most symbolic authority, which is in front of the fireplace." And I was really surprised, because I didn't even want to be sitting there. And this woman then was sort of perceiving that anytime I spoke in the dialogue, that somehow I was speaking down at people. But in any case, that is not what was happening. But the reason I'm mentioning that story is that it's probable that the woman who had the problem with where I was sitting may have had a problem, as a lot of people have, with authority. And sometimes women have problems with male authority, and males have problems with female authority. So unconsciously, the woman may not have been aware that what was taking place and was causing her annoyance was not something outside of herself, but something taking place within herself that she was not conscious of. So proprioception means that we have the capacity in certain situations to discover what we are up to that point unconsciously aware of. However, we cannot access that intentionally. It's not something I can suddenly sit here and say to myself, I now want to discover what's going on inside of me that's motivating what I'm saying, feeling, and thinking, but is unconscious. I have the freedom to ask the question, is there something inside me? But I don't have the power or the ability to consciously discover that. And I'm proposing neither do human beings in general. And that is not a problem, because we can take a stepping stone in the direction of something that we cannot intentionally cause. And that stepping stone is simply, what I can do is be open to the possibility that there are influences at work in me that I'm not aware of. Now, that means being open then to the possibility that I don't know my own mind. Because if I start with the premise that I do know my own mind, and that there aren't any unconscious influences at work, how then could I ever discover that there were? So somehow or another dimension of dialogue could be the exploration into, why is there a fear about even such a conversation, that we're all sitting down in a circle. It's never occurred to me before that I don't know my own mind. Somebody starts to articulate something about that at the meeting in a manner that shares some sort of a logic that, yes, it's not only a fact that we don't fully know our own minds, but it's also a gift, because it's that allows for spontaneity. So there is nothing wrong with not knowing our own mind, but there's something dangerously wrong in believing that we know our own mind, which often then results in believing our own belief systems and especially those belief systems that are very rigid, as, for example, what occurs in either Muslim fundamentalism or Christian fundamentalism or Hindu fundamentalism, where people are not aware that the problem is not the beliefs they hold, the problem is the beliefs that hold them. And that becomes an enormous danger, because the beliefs that hold people, particularly as part of a group where everybody has the same belief, can ultimately result in the most extraordinary catastrophes. And the Holocaust is just one example of that. There are so many other examples in history, and also examples in what is taking place in the world right now. So then dialogue in this new form is, in my view, the emergence of something that's necessary in some way. There's a sort of a necessity to it at this point in time, because 1,000 years ago or 100 years ago, humans didn't have the capacity to totally destroy the world. I mean, the world from the point of view of the total of humanity in its totality, but they might have had the power to destroy sections of humanity, which of course was what happened throughout history. But now there is the power to destroy the totality of humanity, which means even though we are advancing technologically, we have to advance from the perspective of maturity. Because if the technology isn't used with maturity, it has all sorts of implications that remain dangerously hidden from people who are developing the technology, which that then brings in another aspect. You see, one of the things people talk about artificial intelligence, but in my view, it's the wrong wording. It's not artificial intelligence, it's artificial knowledge. Knowledge and intelligence are two very different things. Apparently, the root of the word intelligence comes from the Latin intelligere, which means actually, historically or etymologically, the ability to read between the lines. So knowledge and intelligence are two different things. And a story I sometimes tell to communicate that difference is as follows. Apparently during the Ming Dynasty in China, a couple of centuries ago, there was a city, and in this city, there was a university, and in this university, there was a professor who was very learned in knowledge, but he became aware that up on the mountain that happened to be located beside this city, there was rumors that up in that mountain, there existed a very wise man called Nanin. So the professor then decided that in order to actually gain some of this wisdom that this man, Nanin, was reputed to possess, the professor decided to travel up the mountain to see could he find where Nanin lived. So eventually he came across this little cabin, and he thought maybe this is where Nanin is living. And he knocked at the door and he said, "Is this Nanin's house?" And the person who opened the door said, "Yes, I am Nanin. Please come in." So the professor went in, and Nanin, which is a big tradition in China, the tea drinking. So Nanin, anyway, sat the professor at the table in his kitchen and sat himself across the table and put his cup, his own cup, at that side, and put the professor's cup on the table across from him. Then Nanin goes out, boils the kettle, makes the tea, and comes back in and stretches over with the teapot to where the professor is sitting and pours in the tea into the professor's cup. Except when the cup is already filled, Nanin continues to pour into that cup, and the tea pours out over the top of the cup onto the saucer, fills the saucer, pours onto the table, and pours down over the professor's pants that he's wearing. And the professor is getting exasperated at Nanin. And he says, "What are you doing? Look at what you're doing. My pants is already covered in tea." And then Nanin said to him, "You see, the problem you have is that you are full of knowledge. And when I give you my wisdom, the knowledge can't enter or the wisdom cannot enter because you're already full of knowledge. So I'm using the cup to symbolize something. If you want to receive my wisdom, first empty the cup." So the professor obviously realized a profound event that had just occurred in his life, and perhaps at that moment became aware for the first time there is a huge difference between knowledge and intelligence. And there's also a problem if that difference is not noticed or not recognized. People with lots of knowledge and university degrees, which is important, knowledge is important. The problem is, and my experience of having graduated from 2 different universities was that I noticed that people were falling into the trap that the more learned they were about knowledge, the more they assumed they were becoming more intelligent. But the reality is, once you make that assumption, and if I'm caught in that belief system and you say to me, point something out to me that I am wrong about or not seeing, my ego will resist what you're saying. In other words, I will resist because I will have such an assumption about how intelligent I am, and it may be a very false or limited, at least, assumption. I won't be able to hear what you're saying. So this is why some of these elements need to be explored. Now, one of the other pioneers of this new form of dialogue was also a psychiatrist who lived in London called Patrick DeMare. And I first met Patrick DeMare in 1991 or 1992 maybe, when I had a meeting with David Bohm, and I asked David Bohm, I met David at Birkbeck College in London, where he was emeritus professor. And I asked him in that meeting, who did I need to talk to in addition to himself that would allow me to have more of a deeper understanding of this radically new development that David Bohm had described as being the germ of something new, this new form of dialogue. And David Bohm said, "You must talk to Patrick DeMare." I had never heard of Patrick DeMare up to that point in time. I was leaving London the following day in the evening, but during that day I was attending a seminar. But I decided I'd phone Patrick DeMare, and I said to Patrick DeMare, is there any possibility we could meet? But we'd have to meet at 7 o'clock in the morning because I was going to a seminar and flying back to Ireland that evening. Remarkably, and to my great delight, Patrick said, come at 7 o'clock. He lived in Hendon in London. So I arrived and we met, and that was the beginning of a really close relationship between Patrick DeMare and myself, which continued until his death in 2006, I think. So, and a relationship with a really close relationship also with his wife, between me and his wife, Turid, who I think was a very important influence in Patrick's life. So Patrick DeMare would raise, he had experimented with dialogue and different group sizes for a long number of years. And for example, he had also experimented that creating an environment that instead of a one-to-one therapy session with his patients, he created an environment where a number of his patients and himself would come together and sit in a group circle where each person was free to say whatever they liked. This led to an extraordinary discovery. And the discovery was because when the patients were talking, a lot of the time they were talking about the influences the outside world was having on them, not just talking about their own psychiatric condition. And Patrick was engaging in that form of dialogue with them. And then what Patrick told me and many others, he realized, you see, the problem is not that there is sort of psychiatric or mental imbalances in individuals. He discovered that society itself had mental imbalances. And of course, that's a huge statement. And he realized that society has to find a way of attending to its own mental imbalances. And then another thing Patrick said, which is very important, he asked a question: how is it that intelligent people create such horrific cultures or environments? In other words, how is it? He recognized that it's not that people are stupid, people are intelligent. But for some reason, even though we are intelligent, we create environments that are very unintelligent. Like, for example, I'm not in the slightest against vaccination. However, I was really shocked that in the last 2 years, the culture that got created, or the environment that got created by those who had the power to decide the environment that would get created in response to the challenge of the pandemic, it was an environment in which group mind was dominant. In other words, there was the censorship of voices. I don't mean crackpot conspiracy theorists, but voices of professors and other learned people who were expressing a different view than was being expressed by those who were controlling the narrative. They were being censored. So in other words, a culture got created by very intelligent people because the heads of the medical environment and the heads of the political heads are not, these are not unintelligent people, but somehow they unwittingly created an environment which wasn't unintelligent, which meant then that wrong decisions were made. And of course, we are now in a situation where those wrong decisions have been more and more are revealing themselves. So at the time when I was aware of this happening, I wrote to all the politicians proposing the need for this new form of dialogue, which doesn't allow for censorship. And I wrote to all the media, and I wrote a second time when I was getting more and more concerned that there wasn't this type of communication taking place that was absolutely essential. Now, the only thing is, there is a potential advantage in what went wrong, but that advantage can manifest if now people are sort of brave enough and courageous enough to look at what happened. We cannot change history, but we certainly can learn from it. And if people are able, and the powers that be are able to, with courage, look at the mistakes, so-called mistakes they made, then the next time around, something maybe far more serious than COVID is facing the human race, there is the possibility then of creating an environment that's intelligent and able to come to intelligent responses in meeting such a challenge. That, in a sense, I feel, is why this new germ, which David Bohm said this new form of dialogue is, and personally, I also very strongly agree with that. That's why it needs to be explored. But also, in my view, because it's the germ of something new, even those of us who are involved in exploring this dialogue, we have to be also open to misunderstandings that may have taken over our thinking that we haven't yet discovered. Like, for example, you see, if David Bohm died in 1992, if David Bohm was still alive, he would have then been continuing to explore this new form of dialogue. So he may have made discoveries, for example, that would have him saying something maybe different, or saying it in a different way than what he said while he was alive. Like, I'll give you an example of what I think, because David Bohm was such a creative individual, his understanding would have expanded. What are we really talking about then? What's the need? The need is for the transformation of our understanding. And that means discovering misunderstandings. You see, David Bohm, for example, used to say that violence is undue use of force. And what he meant was violence undue means inappropriate use of force. And that statement I wondered about, and in a conversation with a friend of mine, Peter Garrett, years ago, I suddenly woke up one morning and I realized and phoned Peter and said, but Peter, undue use of force doesn't actually mean no force. It means its measure is incorrect. The Greeks defined well-being as everything being in right measure. So just to quickly tell you a story that links into what I'm now talking about. When I lived in California, in the 1980s when I was in university, I would come back to Ireland about once every 6 months because I had businesses here in Ireland operating, and I had then the responsibility to come back to make sure that things were working out okay in my businesses. I had put people in charge of these businesses. In any case, I'm a very enthusiastic tennis player, but unfortunately not a very good one. But in the tennis club in Tramore where I lived, when I was home just for a 2-week or a week-long break, I was down to tennis playing a tennis match. And I knocked one of my brand new tennis balls over the fence and into the house beside the tennis club. Now, I was already aware that the owner of that house, the man that owned the house, was very unfriendly. And when the youngsters would knock their tennis balls over the wall, he would never return the tennis balls. And at that, in Ireland at that stage, these tennis balls are expensive. But I said to myself, to heck with that, I'm going to go out of the club, sneak in his driveway, and I'm sure the ball might be visible. And I just grab the ball and leave with great speed. But when I went into his house and into the little garden on the front, there was no sign of the tennis ball. And then I suddenly realized it's probably at the back of the house it's after going to, in his back garden. And I'm standing there wondering, will I sneak around to the back of the house, grab the ball and make a run for it? And as I'm pondering that question, his front door opens. And there's this quite large 18 or 19-year-old son has opened the door, the man's son. And I say to him, look, my tennis ball is around the back. And I'm to do something here. So just to continue the story, so then I said as I mentioned, I had said to him, can I please go around the back and get my tennis ball? And he very aggressively said, not a chance, or no way, or whatever. And then I said to him, well, is there any possibility you would go around the back of the house and get the tennis ball? And he once again got sort of aggressive and told me, not a chance, no way. And right at that moment, as I stood in front of him and was about to turn around and leave, spontaneously, my anger surfaced. And I started to say, that is the most stupid thing. And without relaying exactly how I responded, which would involve some curse words, which I better not use, I got really, really expressed my anger and said this was the most stupid thing I have encountered, and it's such an abuse. And I turned around and started to walk away. And with that, I heard this sort of gentle voice saying, well, hang on a second there and I'll get you the ball. So he goes around to the back of the house, picks up the tennis ball, comes around to the front where I'm still standing, and hands me the tennis ball. And there is like a friendship underlying the interaction between us. He's handing me the tennis ball in a friendly manner. So I say, well, look, thank you very much. And I turn around and I started to walk out to go back to the tennis court. And I'm bemused and I'm wondering what's after happening there. And what occurs is I have an insight. it's not a fact that what my insight told me is a definite fact, but it is a fact that this is what came to me in that insight. And the insight I had was that in some way, my anger somehow that I'd expressed at that moment, I was being true to myself. I was somehow free of all this stuff about political correctness and detachment. I was true to myself. And it occurred to me, because I was true to myself, I triggered in him something where he was then, at that moment, able to be true to himself. And what I wondered was, at that moment, was he then, after freeing himself from the very almost tyrannical behavior his father was engaging in? And in other words, he, at that moment, may have become free of his father. And in being free of his father, he could then be himself. This was what I had wondered, and it was what made a certain amount of sense. So coming back to this statement by David Bohm that violence is undue use of force, when I called Peter Garrett and phoned him, I said, you see, Peter, undue not only means too much force then, it means too little force. And in some way, the force that exerted itself, I am proposing at that moment with that person and me, was somehow appropriate. It was at an appropriate level. And that meant then that it worked. So context is what defines what's appropriate. So in any case, for me, that was a very, very important moment, because I had been exploring in another charity I'm involved in. I had been exploring the subject of detachment. And I suddenly realized I had detached from some sort of ideal about detachment, which was really a different form of detachment, because I detached from that ideal, oh, one must never get angry. So it was a tremendous liberating moment in my life, and in a sense has contributed significantly over the years to my ability to defend myself, but also to defend others, especially those others that are not able to defend themselves. So that's just a story to try and convey the spirit of something. So dialogue then doesn't mean like that we're all engaging in the effort to have very harmonious conversation between one another. Sometimes we in this form of dialogue, the freedom to challenge one another is of crucial importance. There is one other thing I want to mention in ending, is that when I say this is a new form of dialogue, I don't mean that it's a better form than other forms. It's just different. But also, I don't mean there are two aspects to this new form of dialogue from my perspective. One is there's what I call the spirit of dialogue, and the other is the practice of dialogue. Practice being engaging in group dialogue with other people, all sitting in a circle. That's the practice. But it doesn't necessarily mean that one has to be involved in the practice of dialogue to be touched by the spirit of dialogue. So there are people I've encountered who have never attended one of these, this type of dialogue meetings, but I've noticed they are touched by the spirit of dialogue. And there's always something very, there's a sort of tremendous openness I find in those sort of people. Also, it doesn't mean, of course, that if one engages in the practice of dialogue, one will be definitely touched by the spirit of dialogue. It may very well happen that one will, but it's not guaranteed. So in that sense, coming back then to different forms of dialogue, with regard to what form of dialogue is appropriate, context is what defines what is appropriate or not. So in one setting, one particular form of dialogue may be very appropriate, and in another context, a different form may be appropriate. And also there are contexts in which it's not appropriate at all, any form of dialogue, in my view. So dialogue, it's not a claim that this new form of dialogue is the solution to all our problems. That would be a wild claim to make. So, a story again. I introduced dialogue in the 1990s, having explored it. I introduced it into my business, my company. And it was a very important thing to introduce because it did totally humanize the culture of the company. Because when I was in California, I had left my company in charge of a group of managers. But then I discovered when I came back from California that two of those managers had sort of created a very, very destructive culture in the company, which was making life a misery for the staff. And that was, I addressed to the best of my ability when I returned. But one of the things I did in order to address that, I invited everybody to participate in dialogue meetings, including the two managers who had somehow made life a bit of a misery for the staff when I was away in California for the 3 years. And then what happened was, because my understanding in those years of this new form of dialogue was quite limited, as my understanding of this new form of dialogue will always be limited. That's the mystery of understanding. But even though our understanding is somehow always limited, in other words, it's not capturing the totality of something or the total picture of something, it nonetheless is important. And also what's important, of course, is that our understanding is continuously transforming. So what happened in my company was even though the culture became much more humane, somehow or another, responsibility got mixed up. And suddenly, we entered a sort of a realm where responsibility was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And we lost a decisive age, which comes when there are the necessity for hierarchical structures. In other words, hierarchical structures don't always have to be destructive. But when they don't exist at all in, say, for example, the running of a company, it becomes quite flaky, I discovered. And that's what I meant by responsibility was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And then the company started to malfunction from a materialistic perspective, and we ended up losing loads and loads of money. And after a certain number of years, arrived at a situation where we were effectively bankrupt. There seemed to be no hope for the survival of the company. But I was still experimenting, and grateful that I was, with this whole dialogue spirit. So I called a meeting of the company, invited everybody to attend, which was a dialogue meeting for us all to come together and explore in conversation together how we could maybe do things that would avoid the demise of the company. So we were all sitting in circles in the meeting room, and the usual conversation about, well, what about this? And there was a girl sitting beside me on my right side who I had hardly known at that time because she had only joined the company. But I could sense she's about to explode. I could sense the energy coming from her, but I didn't know what was going on. So the dialogical conversation continued for another 20 minutes. And then she did erupt. And what she erupted at that moment, which took tremendous courage by her to have done, going against the whole group, including me. And she says, "Why are you continuing talking? Action is what's needed. In a number of our departments, there is no work for the people working in those departments. Why don't those people now take their holidays?" And at that moment, a very unusual thing happened for me. Up on my about 3 feet above my head on the right side, I actually physically felt something physically moving. And somehow at that moment, I knew with certainty the company would survive. And it was one of those moments where we can know something, but not know how we know. But I just knew with total certainty. And it transpired then that I put that girl in a position of authority in the company, and she turned out to be a huge influence on bringing all us men down to earth, because we were mostly a male company in the motor business. And her contribution then following on proved tremendously important, as did my own as well, in the company surviving from a position of impossibility. And that's all these years later, the company and my business is in a very strong position. So I just tell that story because it also communicates something that I feel is important. And that is the courage becomes the central requirement, because it takes courage to go against a group. I felt very strongly that in Ireland anyway, there was a sort of a group controlling the pandemic. And I'm not, they may have been, they were under such pressure, I can understand mistakes they would have made. But I also had the suspicion that there were some very forceful people operating in that group who was controlling the decision-making process about the pandemic. And I have the suspicion there was other people who somehow in that group that may have known mistakes were being made, but weren't able to speak up or weren't able to stand up and be counted. So this is another element in this new form of dialogue. The courage to not only speak out, but also being able to discover more and more you're right to speak out. It's not that you have the necessity to be right, but you have the right to speak out. And that right then can, with time, with people exploring together, be much more fully respected. And consequently then, the group avoids the trap of falling back into some safer space where we're all harmoniously agreeing with one another. It does require the space and the respect for difference. And it's difference that makes or can make the difference.